Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for another episode of Ships of War, the series where I look at historic warships, the famous, the not so famous, and sometimes the downright notorious. And in addition to sort of situating them in their historical context, I'll try and see how they're represented in a particular game system. And comparing it to their actual performance in real life, attempt to judge and to gauge how fair the said game system treats them. And today I'm going to be picking on two vessels in Avalon Hill's classic naval strategy game War at Sea. And my chosen antagonists are the British battleship HMS Duke of York and the German, well, technically the Germans would have called her Panzerschiff, armored ship. I personally prefer battle cruiser, just for the purposes of sort of converting her into the common currency, if that makes sense. So I've always regarded Scharnhorst as a battleship. So battleship? See, I'm doing it already. Battle cruiser. Some people regard her as a sort of a light battleship. Yet others would regard her as an extremely powerful super cruiser. But, you know, the truth as ever with these things is muddied. Now, for those of you who've watched my series on Victory in the Pacific, the combat ratings in War at Sea are identical, certainly for surface ships. But for those of you who've never heard of either game, it's very straightforward. The first number is the vessel's armament or offensive rating. The middle number is the defensive rating, and the last number is the vessel's speed. So just a little bit about these two ships, because although they're both quite famous in their own way, they're not quite the glittering names that, you know, a Yamato or a Bismarck or a Warspite or an Iowa would be in relation to histories of the Pacific War. Pacific. We see, I'm really losing my words. Of World War II. Sorry, everyone. And part of the reason was, although Scharnhorst is quite well known, Duke of York is somewhat more obscure. So I'll begin with the British ship. Briefly, she was a member of the five-strong King George V class battleships. Now, these were the last of Britain's treaty-compliant battleships. And although they were very capable units as designed, there was a little bit lost in the execution. Nothing wrong with the design as such, but the British were trialling some rather novel concepts in this class. And the trouble, as always, when you introduce a novel concept, either just before or even worse during a war, you don't really have the peacetime luxury of a lot of time to iron out all the kinks. So, although they were good ships and gave very good service, the King George V class did have a few problems, which I'll touch on in a little more detail in a bit. Duke of York herself was one of the late arrivals. She wasn't actually completed and commissioned into service until 1941, so the war was well underway by the time she came into service, and it was a bit of a while before she was able to be fully worked up. Now, Scharnhorst was a bit more fortunate in that regard. She was part of a two-ship program, and she was the class lead ship, at least on paper. Her only other sister ship was Gneisenau, and the two were so closely, every sister ship varies a little in appearance, but Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were pretty close, and you could only really tell them apart by the different placement of the mainmast. Unlike Duke of York, which was the result of steady progress in design, you know, the British had a pretty good idea of what they wanted within the straitjacket of the naval treaties. The Germans ended up having a bit more of an involved discussion because initially Hitler wanted something that was a bit like an improved Graf Spee type. He wanted the same armament, he wanted high speed, but he wanted lots more armour and protection. In some respects, he wanted an unsinkable commerce raider. Now, the German Navy did not like this idea at the time because they argued that such a ship would be of very limited utility relative to its expense. And they actually wanted a design that was a bit bigger and that had three rather than two main battery turrets. So the argument went back and forth. Hitler didn't want anything too big because he'd only just agreed the Anglo-German naval agreement. He wasn't ready to upset the British just yet. It doesn't seem to have occurred to him that building a ship that was very obviously a commerce raider would probably upset the Royal Navy more than a ship that was completed as a battle cruiser or a small battleship, but which was on paper at least weaker than anything in the Royal Navy's battle line. That would seem a lot less harmful. Ultimately, the German Navy got their way, and the two ships were completed just before the war. Scharnhorst, in fact, entering service in 1939. So when war broke out, she was one of Germany's two most modern heavy warships. So just a quick look at the vessels themselves, because they are quite different in appearance. Let me just dig out my photos. Now, the King George V, as exemplified here by Duke of York, they look very conventional on the broadside. So it may come as a surprise to those of you who've spotted the fact that they've got three main battery turrets. They mounted 10 14-inch guns as their primary armament. And for those of us who are used to mentally dividing guns up neatly, you'd be forgiven for thinking, 10? 10? How the heck have they distributed those? And the answer was 4 in A, 2 in B, and another 4 in X. So yes, a very unusual distribution of guns, which the British had never tried before. The secondary battery of 5¼ inch guns were mounted in 8 twin mounts, 4 on each side, 2 in the forward superstructure, 2 in the after, and that arrangement's repeated on the other side of the ship, and a reasonable battery of lighter guns, which did include multiple pom-poms, so a decent AA defense for the late 1930s, although I say decent, the experience of war was to very rapidly cause a reassessment of that. So that is what Duke of York looked like. Let me bring over Scharnhorst. So you see what I mean about Scharnhorst being a much more conventional looking battleship, or battle cruiser in this case. Very reflective of German naval practice in terms of how they like to organize their superstructures, reconnaissance planes, of course. Duke of York was designed with aircraft facilities too, incidentally. The German ship also had a 3-turret arrangement in keeping with the Kriegsmarine's wishes, and she mounted 3 11-inch guns in each turret. She had a slightly unusual secondary battery arrangement where colliding with my camera. The secondary guns were 5.9-inch, so somewhat larger than their British counterparts, but these didn't really have a dual role like the British ones did. The Germans intended them only for surface use, and they had 2 enclosed twin gun houses on each side, weirdly slightly matching the British arrangement of having one set near the forward superstructure and the other aft. But they also had 2 more of these guns on each side in single mounts behind much weaker gun shields. So there was evidently a need to save weight there that had prevented them from fitting, if they'd had the capacity, fitting a 3rd twin, because these were all-weather gun houses like their British counterparts. That might have been a better idea, but for whatever reason, it wasn't done. Now, as designed, neither capital ship had torpedoes, although by the mid-war period, Scharnhorst benefited from deck-mounted triple torpedo tubes, 2 of them, which had been filched from the light cruiser Nürnberg, so Nürnberg's loss was her gain. What about careers? So Duke of York spent most of her wartime career in northern European waters. At first, she was mainly there to be part of the home fleet. The presence of German battleships in the form of Tirpitz primarily, and also the heavies, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, meant that she couldn't venture too far because she was part of the force that was intended to keep them bottled up and basically take away as much as possible of the Kriegsmarine's strategic mobility. If those ships could be destroyed, so much the better. So that was her main mission. Scharnhorst had a bit more. Oh, just realised cat hair. Sorry. Scharnhorst had a bit more of a varied career. She had taken part in the German operations against Norway in 1940. She'd participated in a number of commerce raids, including the highly successful Operation Berlin. I say successful because she and Gneisenau came home without a scratch. And over the course of this operation, they sank 22 Allied merchant ships, which is a lot. But considering the tonnage of the ships committed to this operation and the fuel that was expended and all the rest of it, it really could have been achieved by, lighter, cheaper vessels, I don't know, U-boats possibly, without risking a capital ship with a very large crew. But that's just my opinion. Operation Berlin was a qualified success. Their finest hour perhaps came with the Channel Dash in 1942, where they gave the British very red faces by cutting through the English Channel to get back to German ports for repairs. They'd left Brest on the French coast. And despite detecting the ships early, the British response was unfortunately what you could politely call a bad day. The counteroffensives were uncoordinated. Aircraft didn't properly tie their attacks in with sea units. There were no heavy ships in the vicinity that were able to stop them. Basically, nearly everything went the Germans' way. And I say nearly because they didn't quite make it to Germany unscathed. Mines did cause a bit of a scare, and Scharnhorst had a bit of a worrying time. Thereafter, Scharnhorst ended up in northern waters of Norway, and this was partly because Hitler had a very odd obsession with the idea that the British were going to conduct an amphibious invasion of Norway to open up the flank and attack the Reich from yet another quarter. But also, she was positioned to intercept the Arctic convoys. And this is what generated the circumstances where the two ships actually met each other in battle at the very end of 1943, December 25th into 26th to be exact. So Duke of York was part of the cover of convoy JW55B, and Scharnhorst had been sent out to intercept that very convoy. The weather was absolutely atrocious, which stripped Scharnhorst of her destroyer escort very fatefully. I won't labour over the details of the battle because they're very well known, but Scharnhorst, operating on her own and in a rather hesitant fashion, was set upon by a very experienced and very well coordinated set of Royal Navy task groups, both the destroyers who comprised the fighting escort for the convoy, the nearby close support cruiser force, and finally Duke of York herself with the cruiser Jamaica and yet more destroyers. So it certainly wasn't a fair fight. And actually, by the time Duke of York got onto the scene, Scharnhorst had already been worked over a bit by the British vessels. I do have some paintings here by two very famous British war artists. The first is Charles Pears. Now, I have mixed feelings about Pears because he painted very dramatic, beautiful naval scenes, but he plays with reality in the interests of telling a good story. Now, you can see Scharnhorst over there banging away with her secondary guns at the destroyers and light ships that surround her. And you can see lots of lights on the horizon where the lighter British ships are gamely shooting back. Now, all this did sort of happen, but at this stage of the battle, or indeed any stage of battle, there is no way that Duke of York was that close to Scharnhorst. But the beauty of this painting for me is that never mind the distances and the tactical reality, it basically shows how the British piled onto this ship. And sank her in what was a very well conducted operation. As I say, the British weren't interested in sponsoring a fair fight. They had a mission to protect a very vulnerable convoy, and in so doing, if they could remove one of Germany's most powerful remaining naval assets, then so much for the good. Needless to say, they did it, and I'll bring in Norman Wilkinson, who is the somewhat more realistic of the two painters. That is Scharnhorst's final moments, or at least she isn't far off. And you can see some British destroyers are nearby. But aside from closing to launch torpedo attacks, they didn't really get that close until it was very clear that Scharnhorst was going. And that was when they attempted to pick up some of the survivors. So that was the end of Scharnhorst. She came to grief on 26 December 1943. Duke of York ultimately joined the British Pacific Fleet in end of 1944, beginning of 1945, and she survived the war and unfortunately fell victim to the parlous state of the British economy, because as soon as the dust had settled, by the late 1940s, most, if not all, of the King George V's were in mothballs in the Gairloch. Up in Scotland, and by the 1950s the decision had been taken to scrap them after various alternate uses were considered for them. So that was a bit sad, but to be honest, Britain couldn't have afforded to keep them, and the day of the battleship was, sadly, because I love them, very much over. So much for the a very, very potted history of the two ships. How fairly have they been treated? So Duke of York has an advantage over Scharnhorst, which on the surface of it, I think is quite a fair rating because, okay, the Duke of York had a massive advantage with her, 10 14-inch guns. I've got a lovely Imperial War Museum picture over here of her turret gun crew, or at least part of them. And that's taken after the Battle of the North Cape, as the sinking of Scharnhorst was known. So she had more barrels than Scharnhorst did, and she also had guns of a bigger caliber. In terms of propellant, penetrating power, all of that, both German and British guns performed equally well, at least in theory. So some might wonder why Duke of York hasn't been given a 5, really, because it sounds like she was quite far ahead of Scharnhorst. But I think that is fair because I'd mentioned at the beginning of this video that the King George V class suffered from a number of technical problems. And one of them, unfortunately, was the quadruple turrets. They gave a lot of trouble because while they were very elegant in principle and design, the hoist mechanisms in particular had a lot of issues that really needed a few years of peacetime to work out. If you want an example of how badly it could go wrong with a brand new ship, and you'll understand why the British never committed such a new battleship again, Prince of Wales in her fight against Bismarck in May 1941, by the time she drew away from the German battleships, she'd lost 9 of her 10 main battery guns, and none of them were to hits. The guns had either jammed or malfunctioned, or the mechanism serving their ammunition supply had failed. Now, Duke of York didn't suffer anything that drastic because she'd had a bit more of a workup time by the time of North Cape. But I think the technical problems, which never really went away over the course of the war, do justify her only having a slight edge over Scharnhorst. Now, what about the protective scheme? Because that's another interesting one. It's a bit of a trope that German ships in this period were, broadly speaking, unsinkable. I can see why they have that reputation, although I do dispute it whenever I get the chance. When you look at the designs of the two ships in terms of what is known now, bearing in mind this single-digit protective rating is based on the armor protection and the ship's ability to survive flooding. In terms of watertight subdivision, pumping systems, and generally anything that is designed to keep her afloat in action, Duke of York actually is somewhat ahead of Scharnhorst. Now, this is partly a product of her slightly, very slightly greater beam and extra compartmentation. But overall, the protective scheme in the King George V class, both the passive and the anti-flooding, was actually really good. The British were really trying to secure what I want to call unsinkability for the King George V class. They didn't quite make it, but they did pretty well. And in terms of numbers of compartments and pumping systems, I would say Duke of York should actually be slightly ahead of Scharnhorst. But what about armour? Because both ships had a slightly different concept behind their armour and protection systems. The Germans went for a pattern of protecting vital areas quite heavily and nominally armouring other areas, but not to the same degree. And of course, they had the speed of the ship to consider. They wanted Scharnhorst to be fast, so they couldn't encumber her with too much armour. The British went for a very heavily defended citadel amidships. And in fact, if I bring back the photo, unlike the previous class of British battleships, the Nelsons, where they had internalized the armour within the hull form for hydrodynamic purposes, as well as helping them to angle it. In the King George V class, the very heavy citadel armour was bolted to the outside of the hull. Now, even with the fairing, which you can see, this didn't do wonders for the ship's speed, but it was a reasonably strong arrangement. So in terms of side armour, the British were marginally ahead. At its thickest, the belt of Duke of York was 15 inches of steel, as opposed to about 13 and a bit inches in Scharnhorst. I have to allow for metric into imperial, which does yield some funny numbers. The turrets were actually slightly better protected on the German ship. So you see what I mean about the Germans going for specific areas and armouring them as much as possible, whereas the British are trying to cover more ground. The turrets on the British ship, their strongest face was 13 inches, so just an inch behind the Germans. The side and top and rear armour of the turrets, both sides basically broke even. Control towers, conning towers. The German one was very heavily protected with a 13 and a bit inch face, so really heavy armour, tapering to 4 inches at the rear end. The British took a very big risk with Duke of York. Her conning tower armour was only 4.5 inches at its thickest. They were accepting the relatively low likelihood of a direct hit, never mind what happened to Prince of Wales's bridge during the Bismarck action. Because of the height, they were going for a lighter protective scheme. And the height is important because looking at the British one, their armoured conning tower would have been built into the structure up there somewhere. And so you're quite a few stories above the waterline. In the German ship, your primary nerve center is actually quite a bit lower. The armored conning tower pilot house would have been about there, so not quite as high up as on the British ship, and enabling them to stick a bit of armor on it, or quite a bit more, I should say, really. But of course, in both ships, the eternal problem persisted. You needed these high superstructures for all the advanced targeting and communications and radar gizmos. But unfortunately, the higher and more sophisticated they got, the harder it was to protect them properly. The very last thing I'll look at is the secondaries. 5.5 inches around the German ships in their weatherproof batteries. The British secondaries were much thinner, 2 inches at most. So those 5.25 inch guns would have been very vulnerable to a hit. The British win out in deck armour. Their armoured decks were 6 inches thick, tapering down to about 5 inches. The German decks, at their very thickest, even on the heavily protected tops, maximum of 4 inches. So I've thrown a lot of numbers at you, I realise, but I think what the upshot is that on balance, that's probably not unfair. I'm slightly tempted to downgrade Scharnhorst to a 4 because of where she is relative to watertight compartmentation, but that might be a little bit mean of me. And another consideration is that, as the game designers said, they did have to make the German ships a little bit more survivable in order to make the game interesting for the German player. There is a very heavy emphasis on U-boats in War at Sea, but it also is words. It is also very much a surface action game, and the German units do have to have a reasonable chance in game terms of coming home. There are optional rules whereby really powerful ships like Bismarck and Tirpitz can have their armor ratings downgraded to a more realistic level rather than the 9 double exclamation mark that they've been given in the game. But I'm tempted to say that all things considered, a 5 and a 5 works for me. Now, lastly, what about the speed? Now, I'd alluded to the fact that bolting the armor to the outside of Duke of York's hull didn't do anything for her hydrodynamics, and it didn't really. Elegant battleships though they look, it's not. She's not quite got the flair of earlier British battleships, and she's really just there to do what she's got to do. They never imagined that high a speed being necessary in this class. It was a compromise in order to try and meet the treaty restrictions. Scharnhorst, by contrast, now there's a ship that's built for steaming. She and Gneisenau were completed with rather dumpy, almost straight bows to begin with, but these were very quickly replaced with the very elegant Atlantic bow that you see there. And just look at that gorgeous hull form. That is very much a Greyhound designed to sprint. And so it was. So even though the Scharnhorst was only powered by 3, engines driving only 3 shafts, whereas Duke of York had 4, the German ship could achieve a maximum speed of 32 knots, and most significantly, because her engines were so efficient, she could manage 30 knots sustained steaming in all weather conditions, nearly all. The conditions under which she was sunk probably represent the worst she was ever in, but most of the time she had no problems whatsoever. The British ship was designed for a maximum speed of 28 knots, but aside from her trials, where she slightly exceeded that, she never really quite managed that speed. And it's no surprise given that she spent a lot of time in the Atlantic and the Arctic, where the seas are frankly not kind. Her average was really, most of the time, in most conditions, 24 to 25 knots. So I think giving her a point of speed lower than Scharnhorst is extremely fair in the final analysis. I don't know, can you be extremely fair? You're either fair or you're not, I suppose. No. Anyway, it is fair. I'll go with that. So there we go. That is my very, very brief coverage of these two ships and my analysis of how well they are represented in War at Sea. I think they did a really good job there, to be honest. So it's been a great privilege covering these two, especially as we have the Victory in Europe Day 80th celebrations coming up very soon. Some time to remember all these brave fellows. But to all of you, I hope you found this interesting. Thank you so much for following the channel. I really appreciate it. Do look at the other episodes of Ships of War if you would like to. I've got quite a few in online already, and there's more in the pipeline. A big hello to my veterans whose long suffering and endless patience with me is always appreciated. Always great to see you guys, and thanks so much. To anyone who's new here, welcome to my channel. If this is your first video, please do have a meander. I hope you find other things you like. But whoever you are and wherever you're watching from, welcome aboard. It's been really great having you, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Thanks and bye.